Homework 19, Basic Principles of Hypothesis Testing, Video 5, Stating a Conclusion. In the past videos, I've kept alluding to whether or not the sample provides enough evidence to do this or that, and that's pretty much how a hypothesis test will conclude. The gist of a hypothesis test is to determine whether or not a sample provides enough evidence to reject a null hypothesis. So this is the question we're trying to answer. Is there enough evidence to reject what you claim about your population parameter? As such, there's only two possible conclusions to a hypothesis test. I know we haven't gotten to the formal details yet, but the second to last step in any hypothesis test will be state your conclusion. And when you state your conclusion, you will say one of two things only. Conclusion number one, reject the null hypothesis and accept the alternative in its place. You don't have to say all of this. You can just say reject the null. Yes, I know, this looks like a word, this looks funny, get it out of your system. Reject the null and accept the alternative in its place. If your evidence is strong enough to refute your claim, like in the example with the fountain drinks, was a sample of 40-ounce beverages enough evidence to say that the store's claim that the beverages had 44 ounces was incorrect? Well, whether or not it is depends upon some other things, as we'll see in due time. But at the end, if your evidence is not strong enough to reject the null hypothesis, your conclusion is not accept the null hypothesis. Your conclusion is do not reject the null hypothesis and reject the alternative. Technically speaking, you never actually say we accept the null hypothesis. You say one of two things. You reject it or you don't reject it. Now be careful. Rejecting the null hypothesis doesn't mean that it's false. Rejecting the null hypothesis simply means that we had enough evidence to reject it. Think of it as a court of law. If there's enough evidence to conclude someone is guilty, does it mean they are guilty? No, it just means there was enough evidence to draw that conclusion. If there was enough evidence to reject the null hypothesis, it doesn't mean it's false. It just means that the evidence was strong enough to reject it. And similarly, when you don't reject the null hypothesis, that doesn't necessarily mean it's true. That just means we did not have enough evidence to reject it. In a case of law, that's like saying that somebody is not guilty doesn't mean they're innocent. It means there was not enough evidence to conclude that they were not guilty. So again, these are the only two conclusions we're going to draw towards the end of the hypothesis test. You either reject the null hypothesis or you do not reject the null hypothesis. Rejecting it doesn't mean it's false, and not rejecting it doesn't mean it's true. It's just a comment about the strength of the evidence to draw that conclusion.